Good evening, everyone. I am Cindy Reed, one of your panelists tonight. The Illinois Humanities Council welcomes you to the country and the city, common ground in the Prairie State. This series of programs puts the country and the city in dialogue with one another. The first conversation took place in a small rural town known as Pittsfield, Illinois, in September. Tonight, the city portion of that discussion begins in East St. Louis. Now, as a poet and scholar from the city, ideas about urban sustainability and community undergird my work, particularly because this city is often counted out and misrepresented. Take, for instance, an excerpt from my poem, Beauty Through Ashes, a love letter to East St. Louis. Yes, I know we've been beaten down, broken down, pulled down, slowed down, talked down and shot down so much. But that's why I write these words to dust us off, pick us up. For there is an abundance of beauty found through our ashes. I write these words to help us hold fast. I write to give us hope, a voice. I write to give us freedom, to be proud of exactly who we are and stand strong in where we're from. Pump your fists in the air if you know enough is enough. This is our day, East Saint. Stand up, be courageous, be strong. It's time to dance a new dance and sing a new song. And if anybody tries to put our newfound confidence to the test, you be humble, as you ever so kindly remind them. The sun always rises in the east before it can set in the west. We look forward to hearing your own ideas about sustainability and community this evening. Again, welcome to the East St. Louis installment of the series, and thank you for joining us. Now some words from Matt Meacham.
Thank you, Cindy. That was terrific. Howard made a good recommendation, for sure. We appreciate that. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. We're really honored and grateful to have all of you with us. We're grateful to Professor Howard Ramsey of SIUE and everyone here at the Higher Education Center for hosting us. We really appreciate that. My name is Matt Meacham. I'm a program manager with Illinois Humanities based in our Edwardsville office. We're a nonprofit organization that serves as the Illinois affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And on the back of your program is a description of who we are, what we do, and what we can offer. And if any of that interests you, please see me or one of my coworkers, either Kay Ripplemeyer, who's on our panel, or Paul DeRica, our Director of Programs at the back table. We'll be glad to talk with you. This evening's event is the second one in a series called The Country and the City, Common Ground in the Prairie State. The series consists of panel discussions with audience participation about issues that affect both urban and rural Illinois communities. Each discussion draws upon a text as a way of focusing the conversation. There are several reasons why we're presenting this series. One is that a Smithsonian exhibition called Crossroads: Change in Rural America is touring Illinois as part of our Museum on Main Street program. The tour schedule is on page 7 of your program. That exhibit raises important questions about relationships between rural and urban places. Another reason is that this year is the 200th anniversary of Illinois statehood. The complex and sometimes tense relationship between Illinois' major cities and its rural areas has been a significant theme throughout its history, from long before it became a state, even back when ancient Mississippians were occupying where we are right now, all the way up to the present. Each program in this series, as Cindy explained, has a rural version and an urban version, and one of our goals is to generate communication between the communities that host the rural versions and those that host the urban versions. The rural version of this program happened in Pittsfield, and we invited the people who attended that event to write responses to two questions. What's one thing that you'd like urban Illinoisans to know about the community or the area in which you live? And what's one fact, opinion, or idea that was expressed during this discussion that you find especially interesting or important? The handout that you received on your way in contains their answers. We invite you to write your answers to the corresponding questions on the index cards that you picked up on your way in. I think they were folded into your programs. We'd like to share them with the people who attended our Pittsfield event. We'd also like to share some of them on our website. And if you'd rather we not share yours, that's perfectly okay. You can just note that on your card. Also, we invited a 17-year-old student named Ethan Brown, who works for a newspaper in Pittsfield, to write a commentary on last month's event from his perspective as a young local resident. It appears on that same handout that I just mentioned. It represents only one person's viewpoint, so it shouldn't be understood to represent the views of Pittsfield residents or rural Illinoisans in general, but it includes some thought-provoking observations, and we encourage you to read it. The subject of both last month's event in Pittsfield and this evening's event is cultural sustainability and the pursuit of community. How can both urban neighborhoods and rural communities remain culturally vibrant in the face of so much economic and social and cultural change, technological change? How can they maintain their distinct identities while also being inclusive? What kinds of economic foundations do they need to sustain their best cultural characteristics? One reason why we decided to hold the urban version here in East St. Louis is that this is the city of champions, many of whom are cultural champions. It's amazing how many monumental figures in fields such as the arts, literature, and government have called East St. Louis home. Miles Davis, Katherine Dunham, Brother Joe May, Donald McHenry, the list goes on, and I think Cindy will be on that list as well. From all the truly great cultural figures who've come from this city, it's obvious that this city has some truly great culture. Two questions that we want to consider are how East St. Louis and places like it can sustain that culture in the face of so many tremendous challenges, and how that culture can help to sustain East St. Louis as it confronts those challenges. Just three more quick notes. One, different people define the words urban and rural differently. For purposes of this series, we're using urban simply to describe places that are more densely populated and located in or near metropolitan areas, and rural to describe less densely populated places in non-metropolitan areas. But we certainly respect your definitions of urban and rural, whatever they might be. Two, we thank Maryland Catering for the wonderful food. It will be available until 7, so please have all you like between now and then. Thirdly and lastly, there will be opportunities for audience participation during this event. We really do hope you'll participate. All opinions are welcome, including opinions that might differ from those expressed by the panelists. We ask only that you treat others as you would wish to be treated. It's a privilege to introduce the moderator of this discussion, Kelly Covey, founder and principal of the Covey Group based in Chicago. Kelly is widely respected for her skill in leading discussions of complex issues. She's very knowledgeable about social issues that affect major cities, but she's originally from a small town in Texas, so she's familiar with rural culture also. She's both deeply insightful and deeply caring. Please welcome Kelly Covey.
Thank you, Matt, and good evening to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this discussion a lot, especially after we had the one in Pittsfield. So yeah, as Matt said, this is a really personal issue for me in so many ways. I think because I grew up in a small town in Texas, I'm also one of the people who left a small town in Texas and didn't ultimately go back. And I think even though my entire family is still there, that has been an ongoing struggle, I think, through my life. I lived in a number of places. I lived in Buffalo, New York, Devils Lake, North Dakota, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then the last 15 years in Chicago. But I think what's been interesting to me, despite what we hear about sort of urban and rural divides, is that I've seen a lot of the same issues and patterns recur and attitudes recur in all of those places. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting beyond the stereotypes that we have about urban rural places and trying to really share some real stories about what people are seeing and what's going on there. So I'm excited about that. again, I think, just as Matt said, my hope is that we will spend this time to not only explore the things that we have in common, but to really look at some of the differences and share some of those experiences, and that ultimately, we can identify where we have common ground, but also where we see things differently, and that too is important. So we're not going to solve all these problems tonight, but hopefully we will illuminate this, and that you'll walk out of here feeling like, I know something about a community that I didn't know before. As Matt said too, I think the only thing I ask, there's going to be a couple of times where we're going to ask the audience to talk in some small groups, maybe groups of 3 and 4. I'm going to urge you to do that, and maybe also to share some stuff out. I think that will be really important. At one point, we're going to look at a poem, which is probably really weird to some people, and other people not. But when we do look at the poem, it's not going to be English class. We're really looking at that piece to think about what resonates with us, what stands out to us, and how does it connect to our own experience. So I'll say a little more about that later, but just a heads up that a poem is coming, which doesn't excite everybody, excites me. I think lastly, just to repeat, Matt, I think a respectful environment to me just means that you will listen openly, even if you don't agree. So just try to hear and understand, even if you don't agree. Let's see, what else do I need to tell you? Well, I think when I heard this topic of cultural sustainability and the pursuit of community, I was like, what is that? It was such a broad topic to me. So I think in many ways what we've been trying to figure out is what exactly are we talking about? And so I think for this discussion, what I'm hoping we can talk about is that we all kind of know that when economic and social change happens, it doesn't affect everyone equally. All things are not equal. And so what I'm hoping about is that we can sort of focus on and talk about who are the people and places that are struggling. Where is there a lack of opportunity, a lack of resources? And can we talk about those and share some stories about that so we have a better understanding? And then kind of what are the challenges and tensions and divisions that arise as a result of some of those changes and how they're affecting people differently? And then I hope we can move to talking about sort of what gives us hope. What kinds of strengths are we seeing in community as people sort of work to thrive and survive? And I think at the end, I'm hoping we'll get to the point of being able to talk about what opportunities are there for urban and rural people to work together. Are there ideas that people have? Okay. So the way I want to start, normally people just introduce panelists. We're going to do that. But the way I would like to do it is I'm just going to ask everybody, if you can, to break into groups of 3, 4, 5 people, who's ever around you. Rebecca is my colleague, Matt, and I think Paul in the back too. They're going to sort of join in as well. And here's what I'm going to ask you just to think about. I want you to think about something that you do in your own community to help sustain it, make it better, or to build community. What is something you personally do and why you think that's important? And the panelists are also going to talk about this, and then in a minute we'll share a little out and let them introduce themselves. Okay, so about 5 or 6 minutes, let people talk, and not a long time, but hopefully enough time to just share. Okay? Go for it. All right, so wonderful. I hope everybody got a chance to share with somebody that you haven't met. Just a note, if anybody wants to speak, I'm going to ask if people could step up to this mic, only because we're trying to make sure the videographer gets it. I'm sorry that's a little awkward at times, but I'd appreciate that. So how I'd like to start sort of introducing the panel is on this same question that you were just discussing. So if I could ask each of you, maybe just to talk for, I said 3 minutes max, but we'll see how it goes. Say a little bit about sort of who you are, sort of something we may not know about the community that you're from, and then sort of something that you're doing to sustain community or to sustain culture in your own city or town. Yeah. Jim.
My name is Jim.
Oh, sorry. Matt, is there another mic too?
My name is Jim Nolan. I'm from the very small county of Stark, 6,000 people northwest of Peoria, county seat of Toulon, 1,400 in which I live. At the moment, I'm chairing a committee that is seeking to come up with a repurposed multi-service store to replace the grocery store we just lost, something critical to our community. And we think we are making some progress there, have a good committee. People in the community feel strongly that we need to find some way to provide the services, telepharmacy, frozen and hot meals to go, senior meals, cafe, drive-up, convenient service at our Main Street location. The other activity I'm involved in is efforts to reduce wealth transfer. East St. Louis lost a lot of wealth over the past decades. My little rural area is losing wealth daily as farmers die. In the past, the farmers passed their farm on to their sons, who would then farm the property. Today, the farms, upon passage, often are sold to a larger farmer, and the sale value is sent to the heirs who live in Florida and Arizona and out of our area. Dramatic loss of wealth in our communities is going on, and so I'm working with the Galesburg Area Community Foundation to convince people to leave part of their wealth to something like a community foundation to support the community.
Hi, my name's Kay Ripplemeyer. I research and write about history. I grew up, and there's two communities that I've been involved with this way, researching their history and writing books and articles, studies about them. The first, where I grew up, was Valmeyer, a farm community in Monroe County, the town that got washed away in the '93 flood. That community is interesting to me in many ways. It was a very tight-knit German community of people. And then in August of '93, there's 12 feet of water in all the houses. And so it was washed away. But the community still stayed together, wanting to still live together, so they moved up on the bluff. So I research and write about the history of that place. I moved after college in the '70s as part of the Back to Land movement. What was happening at that time in Monroe County is similar to what Jim was mentioning. The farms were getting larger. It was getting to be corporation farming, a lot of relationship with chemical companies. And besides that, you know, daughters weren't left the farms, as he said. So a very patriarchal system. And so I moved south, and the Back to Land counterculture communities of Southern Illinois interest me very much as well. And where I live, the Shawnee National Forest was created, and that sort of took a lot of people off the land, but it brought a whole different kind of community there of people who come to enjoy public land. So those aspects of history in Illinois is what I work on.
Hello again, everyone. I am Cindy Reed. I am a fourth-year PhD student at St. Louis University in the Department of American Studies. My interests include representations of East St. Louis and also representations of Black girls and girlhood, particularly urban Black girls. I am a native of East St. Louis, Illinois, so that makes me officially the resident homegirl on the panel tonight. But that being said, I am not only able to appreciate my city wholeheartedly, but I'm also in a spot because of the experiences that I've had. I'm in a space where I can also critique my city, right? So there is the love and while there is love, there is no romanticizing for me, at least. In addition to that, so one of the ways that I'm working to sustain culture and pursue community in East St. Louis beyond poetry, which I've had the opportunity to share. I have a collection of East St. Louis poems that are go-to poems for events around the city, but also events outside of the city that I've had the opportunity to go around and share at SIUE, for instance, Principia College also, just to name a couple rather. But in addition to that, my scholarship, I focus my academic research on East St. Louis, and I find that it's necessary to interject stories in academia, because even in scholarship, there can be very one-sided narratives, right? That at least need counter narratives. Okay, so that's another way. But my feet to the ground, person to person way of sustaining community, sustaining culture and community is that I am about a 10-year volunteer with the East St. Louis Community Peace Camp that was founded in 1971 in the city by people who love kids in the city. And so what we do is we take, 9 to 14-year-olds to log cabins. I have to say this correctly so it doesn't come off strange, right? We take them to the woods to camp in log cabins with running water and indoor plumbing, okay? But the whole purpose of it is we get the kids out of the city, away from home, just to be kids, to enjoy each other, and to also develop a sense of community within them. So we're not just taking them away to give them a break from home or whatever they may need in that sense. We're doing it to also reinforce East St. Louis is good. And it's good because you're an East St. Louisan, right? So we are trying to build those ideas and those belief sets in our kids who come to camp with us every year. And we usually get around maybe 70 to 80 campers each summer. So that's one of the ways that my person-to-person feet, my grassroots level way of sustaining culture and community.
I'm Vince Thomas. Just give you a little more background than what you have in your programs. In 1958, I arrived in Rock Island as a newspaper reporter. A few years later, I left for a brief sojourn in Mumbai, India, where I'm from originally. Since 1965, Rock Island is my hometown. My wife, sitting here, is a Rock Islander. My daughter is a school teacher in Manhattan Beach near Los Angeles. My son today is in Shanghai. He's speaking about giving a lecture. He's a Chinese scholar, and he's giving a lecture on the 200th anniversary of Marx, which is being celebrated in many other countries. So, coincidentally, in 1958, when I arrived in Rock Island, it was the same year that HUD decided to desegregate the public housing complex. And of course, that resulted in white flight in that section of town. Today, in my opinion, Rock Island is in the same predicament as many small cities around the country, struggling to submerge their past and become part of the changing 21st century. Rock Island is has one of the largest arsenals in the country, based on Rock Island, which used to be the home base of the warrior Black Hawk of the Sauconnaut, and who got half his tribe was wiped out in as late as 1832. That was one of the last Indian wars we had. There is a state park in his honor, and a museum, a history museum. We also have Augustana College, which was established in 1860 by by the Swedish community, which found Rock Island and decided to settle there. It started out as a seminary, and is now a private college which includes diverse and international students, and has a enrollment of about 2,600 or more. And so Rock Island was once called the farm equipment implement capital of the world. John Deere has survived its competitors, and International Farm Oil and J.I. Case have all closed down. It is one place, Rock Island, where the river, the Mississippi, flows east to west. And Iowa, Davenport, Iowa, is to the north, and the Illinois part of the Quad Cities is to the south. So you can take a bet with somebody, where does the river ever flow east to west? So there was a lot of manufacturing in the past. There was steamboats would go through, etc. Abe Lincoln was an attorney for the railroad when one of the barges hit one of the first bridges built across the Mississippi from Rock Island to Davenport. He was incidentally also a lieutenant in the Black Hawk War, and if you read part of his history, he says he never really shot at anybody. So almost all the cities, all these industries along the river have sort of closed down. And in fact, in today's newspaper, which I used to work for, the Argus Dispatch, it says that almost these industries that have disappeared are going to be very long in trying to make a comeback. There's another incident that I'd like to point out. The high rollers of the community now enjoy Juma's Casino, which contributes about $4 million to the city coffers. It's going down from about $6 million just a year ago. And one wonders then, when will this national phenomenon end? Thanks.
So my name is Leone Jose Bicchieri. I'm from Chicago. I'm the founder and executive director of a group called Working Family Solidarity. And what we do is we build racial unity between groups of low and moderate income families, which is much of Chicago. And that means probably 90% African American and Latinos, especially in a neighborhood called Pilsen, where I live, a little bit southwest of the city center. A little bit like Jim's area, different but similar, because we also have investment from a lot of private equity companies in Pilsen, but the money doesn't stay in Pilsen. It's to build, buy this home from a working family that can't pay the taxes anymore, strip it down and build a 3 or 4 flat and sell each of those condos for, $300,000 each. So there's a lot of house flipping. They even have reality shows about it so that everyone really thinks it's funny and everything. But it's not that funny. It's not that funny. A lot of you guys know that from here in East St. Louis. But it's driving out, 215,000 African Americans probably in the last 15 years have left Chicago. For the first time ever, African Americans are not the largest minority population in Chicago. It's now Latinos, because although we've been driven out, not quite as many of us as the African Americans, so now we're just a little bit more above. But between African Americans and Latinos, we're still, 60% or so of the population. And our theory, although we're not a C4, political sort of electoral organization, we're a C3, but Harold Washington, the best mayor Chicago's ever known for all groups of people a long time ago, his coalition was Black, Latino, progressive whites, and so on. It was a very powerful coalition. And for those who would not understand how dangerous it is for a lot of the powers that be in this country to have people of color and whites united in a fight, the young Latino, a guy named Rudy Lozano, who was not the only Latino, but a very prominent young activist who convinced a lot of the Latinos, he's Puerto Rican. There's a little bit of a split between us Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and all that, right? But there's a split between everyone, and that's what we need to deal with, right? But Rudy was killed, shot in the back of the head shortly after Harold Washington was elected. And Rudy's main message is we need to be down for African Americans. And you can see how dangerous messages of unity are between poor and working people. Southern Tenant Farmers Union. Anyone heard of that? Southern Tenant Farmers Working Union? As good an organization as there's ever been in the United States of America. White and black sharecroppers throughout the South coming together. Take a look. Southern Tenant Farmers Union. They were literally murdered out of existence. Like murdered. Every white, black, everybody. Arkansas, Mississippi, everything. Because anyone see the movie with Denzel Washington, The Great Debaters? You see that? Okay, when he's going out into the stables and they're doing that meeting at night, that's the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. Because what they said was, we are going to be united among poor and middle income folks, and then if we have differences, we'll figure them out, right? You guys eat this food, we eat that food. Is that really a big deal? No, right? But you need a home, we need a home. White folks in the country need a home. That's the danger. Remember when Jesse Jackson ran in '84? Remember how people were like, well, some of the wealthy elite saw him as a threat, somewhat, but it was kind of cute, right? He's going to rile up some black folks. In my opinion, one of the things that made the wealthy elite start to get worried about his message when he went to Iowa. Remember that? Farm Aid, Willie Nelson, right? You had white farmers out there. I know people heavily involved in that, right? During Prairie Fire and all that. I mean, white farmers were like, Jesse, Jesse, Jesse. Like 99% white folks, right? Rural folks. Because he was talking about economic issues, about restructuring taxes, making sure corporations that make gazillion dollars pay at least a little bit in taxes, et cetera, right? He was talking about, I'm going to name South Africa at that time, a terrorist nation, right? So he was doing, but he was talking about all groups, and that's what made him, I think, at that time, and things have changed since then. So we're not comparing ourselves to that. We're trying to go forward, though. We do know your rights trainings around labor and housing especially, but some immigration and civil rights, because another thing blacks and Latinos have in common since September 11th of years ago is that ICE, right, Homeland Security, there is no immigration naturalization services anymore, right? That is gone. It was literally destroyed, and Homeland Security came in so that police powers are now run our immigration system, right? Not just kind of like in general, but no, they do. They used to be under the Department of Justice, right? They're not anymore. Not for years. They were all now put under a new thing called Homeland Security. So literally, it's legal. Literally, if I walk out of this room, or any of us, right? Someone can come grab us and take us to a military base, and they don't have to tell our family where we are, right? But we don't really think of those things anymore. And so we're trying to bring people together to realize that we have more in common, that economic issues can help a lot of us to work together, black, Latino, Asian, whites, rural, and urban. I've worked a lot in rural areas, and a lot of the same private equity firms that are buying up a lot of the neighborhoods in Chicago are buying up trailer parks in rural areas, are buying up East St. Louis. So I think we can, and I'll end with this, we are not saying we know what to do, but we think that the wealthy elite in this country have devised a system where we spend so much time fighting each other over ignorant stuff that we don't fight the wealthy elite. We need to get together and do some damage, and someone's laughing all the way to the bank. And it's none of us, right? And when we Latinos think it's blacks that are the problem, and blacks think it's us, and we think it's whites, and none of us are right. It's all of us that are middle income and below. We're all pretty much right. Roughly, right? We have the right to live, and we need to come together, stop blaming each other for really silly things like you have more pigment than I have, or less, and come together. And that will scare the right people. So we want to, that's why we call it working family solidarity. So we hope we can work together.
And if you didn't know what a community organizer is, now you know. Thank you, Leone.
Good night. My name is Claudia Zavala, and I was born and raised in Mexico. I moved to California when I was 20 years old. I was undocumented. And then we decided to move to Illinois because there was a place where I am living that was hiring, instead of 80 $4.25 that my husband was making $4.25 per hour as a field worker. So we decided to move to Illinois where people were making more than $10. That was amazing, more than $10. And also because we believed that we were safe in Illinois, like being undocumented and and I had a child, and we were far away from La Migra, from the immigration police. So, and then later, like 6 years later, I got my documents, and my husband was documented, and then he became citizen, and I became citizen 2 years later. So, and I went to school. I'm a school teacher, bilingual teacher, and I work in this community. I am teaching children from Latin America, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and most of my community, most of my people in my community are from Mexico. So because I am very thankful for what I have, like I learned the language so many years later. I had 3 kids, 2 are serving in the military, and they are bilingual. And I have my son, and he speaks 3 languages. And I'm very proud of my kids, and I feel so thankful, and I feel that I need to give back to my community. And I'm a teacher, and I teach my kids to understand how people feel when they see them when they are different, like they are darker, they speak another language, and they speak English with an accent like me. And then I try to explain to them, I try to make them understand that people just don't they have misconceptions about them, and the only way to help themselves is to study, to go to college, to prove that they are not the immigrants that are making the town to look bad or take their jobs, or no, they have learned the language, get educated, if not, at least get a decent job and not get in trouble. And that's who I am, and thank you for being here.
Wonderful, thank you. So you've all begun to raise some of the key issues that we're hoping we can sort of delve into more. We're going to turn to this point and read the poem a little bit and have that kind of help inform this discussion. So if everybody can turn in their program, there's a page that looks like this that has the poem on it. It says Text for Discussion, Philadelphia Flowers by Roberta Hill. Since we're going to talk in a minute in some small groups, what I'm going to ask you to do is just take a minute and read the poem silently. And as you do, just try to notice what lines or phrases or images stand out to you. And maybe it's because there's something you don't understand or it resonates in some way, but just try to pay attention as you read through what you're struck by personally. And then I'll read it aloud in a second. All right. So if you're still reading, feel free to read along as I read it. I want to just say, part of why I often like to use poetry in discussions is that sometimes poems raise deeper questions for us to explore, and sometimes they also have perspectives that might be hard for us to share, but it's easier if we're reading it on a piece of paper, and it's easier to disagree with a poem than it is sometimes with one another, right? So I'm hoping that's what it can help us do. Okay, so let me read it aloud for everyone. In the cubbyhole entrance to Cornell and Son, a woman in a turquoise sweater curls up to sleep. Her right arm seeks a cold spot in the stone to release its worry, and her legs stretch against the middle hinge. I want to ask her in for coffee, to tell her go sleep in the extra bed upstairs. But I'm a guest, unaccustomed to this place, where homeless people drift along the square bordering Benjamin Franklin Parkway. From her portrait on the mantle, Lucretia Mott asks, when will Americans see how all forms of oppression blight the possibilities of a people? The passion for preserving Independence Square should reach this nameless woman, settling in the heavy heat of August, exposed to the glare of every passerby. What makes property so private? A fence? No trespassing signs? Militia ready to die for it? And taxes? Lights in the middle stories of office buildings blaze all night above me. Newspapers don't explain how wealth is bound to these broken people. North of here, things get really rough. Longshoremen out of work bet on eddies in the Schuylkill River. Factories collapse to weed and ruptured dream. Years ago, Longhouse sachems rowed canoes to Philadelphia, entering these red brick halls. They explained how the law that kept them unified required a way to share the wealth. Inside the hearths of these same halls, such knowledge was obscured, and plans were laid to push all Indians west. The city born of brotherly love still turns around this conflict. Deeper in the dusk, William Penn must weep from his perch on top of City Hall. Our leaders left this woman in the lurch. How can there be democracy without the means to live? So I'm going to ask you to just get in the same groups. We're going to take no more than 5 minutes, but just try to share a line or a phrase or an image that stood out to you and why. And I'll bring you back in 5 minutes, okay? Okay, so I'm wondering before we check in with panelists, if there's anybody that might be willing to come up and just share something that stood out to you and kind of why. Could you make a connection to your community, or did you think of people sort of that came to mind in your own communities as you read it? Anybody who'd like to do that? No, you don't. If you really don't want to, you really don't.
I don't know if we can make this. We'll try to make this work.
What? Can everyone hear? Is there my voice echoing?
Would you? I'm sorry. Would you mind just step up there so that way we'll get it on the video.
Fall, don't you?
We don't want to miss it on the video.
Oh, Matt.
Okay.
Thank
Can you all
you.
hear me now?
Yes.
All right. What stuck out in the point with me was about the businesses leaving and there's nothing there but ruin, weeds and tumbleweeds. And I was sharing with my group how East St. Louis had 170-some thousand population when I was a kid growing up. And this place was plenty. There were jobs all over the place. Everybody knew everybody on the block and everybody looked out for each other. And it didn't matter about the race, creed, or color. There was unity. And to see the businesses leave and all of a sudden there's a mass exodus of the people, it says something about all communities, not just here, but all. We are the people. We vote everyone in. We care about everyone. We must take our power back, and we do have power, each and every one of us, and especially the college students. I love you guys. You're brilliant. Your minds are fresh and raw. So stand for what you believe in. Don't go silently by the wayside. Do something to make a difference. And I guarantee you, you will be remembered, if nothing but for the cause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we get one other who might be willing? All right. Oh, yes, please. Thank you so much. What's your name? Asanete, come on up. Yeah, can you just pull it over? I think it should work. There you go.
My name is Sonate. Hi, everyone. My name is Sonate. I'm a student from Lewis and Clark, Godfrey, Illinois, and part of the Honors College. Anyway, what struck me was the last two lines that say, "How can there be democracy without means to life?" This brings me back to humanity. if we have democracy, like what is democracy if we don't have the means to life? We take democracy for granted so much that we don't see that that's part of our means to life, because democracy is our right to have rights. And this just leaves me with so many questions, and it amazes me that it actually doesn't amazes me. It makes me happy that we're looking into such issues, and for me to be in this kind of an environment is an honor. And thank you. Just
Wonderful. Thank you. So, since we've got some brave people. Oh, yes, please.
I'll make this short. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I started a documentary on democracy several years ago. And in my research, I didn't have the money to finish it, but nevertheless, in my research, democracy is in our DNA. It is actually the best way that humans can survive together. So don't deny it. Don't take it for granted. It's really we have to have it to survive.
Thank you. Anyone on the panel here wants to just weigh in about a particular line, phrase that stood out to you? Connections.
Well, that was it reminded me of the line. They explained how the law that kept them unified required a way to share the wealth. Well, it reminded me of, and we were talking with Leone about the Trail of Tears, when Native Americans were pushed across the Mississippi west and down into Oklahoma. They arrived, but a few thousand died along the way. But when they arrived, they had very little, and with the very little, they started sharing. And that's part of the way they survived. And so when we talk about Native Americans today, we know there's this kind of a revival that's going on, and people are talking about them more than they have before. They've run for public office, and so we can see that when people get together and share what little they have, it strengthens them. And so that's the line that sort of struck me.
Right, thank you.
Coming from Black Hawk country myself.
And Glynis, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because one of the things I'm hoping we can sort of get into is she names a number of groups in the piece, and that's one of the things I'm wondering, this word oppression that comes out, which you could probably divide the country in some ways of who has a feeling, they have a felt understanding of that word and who doesn't. But I'm just curious, in connecting that, like if you could talk a little bit about who in your own community, whether it's people or places or both, are struggling, and that, or that word oppression comes to mind. Cindy, you want to start?
I will start because I have the microphone.
Yeah, there you go.
But I actually have a couple of thoughts about the folks who don't have the means to live.
Yes,
right?
please.
So that last line of the poem, talking about those without the means to live. What it brings to mind for me in East St. Louis, and this is in no particular order, but just it was a brain dump for me. And once one thought started, another thought flowed, and it was almost uncontrolled. Like I had to stop and go to my next point so I wouldn't linger there. But maybe I should have, and that would have been okay. But those who are left in the lurch, those who don't have the means to live, I think about children, particularly as students, that they are academically disenfranchised and under-resourced. I think about victims of trauma, who suffer mental illness, right? And we have to understand that in socioeconomically depressed areas like East St. Louis, mental health is a luxury, unfortunately. It's unfortunate, but that's a reality for many people. So I think about those people who are sort of left out on the fringes. this seems so much more simple. There's a scholar named Jennifer Hamer. She published a book about East St. Louis. I believe it was the early thousands, entitled Abandoned in the Heartland. And she talks about East St. Louis in a way that she describes it in a way that it's not usually described, as I believe it's a commuter city or a commuter burb or something like that, she calls it. Meaning, translation, you need a car to get around, and that's very bizarre for a city. When you think about a city, we think about public transportation, a good, solid public transportation that you can just commute on buses and trains and through cabs and Uber and whatnot, right? Well, Uber now and Lyft now, but not then. You understand my point, though. But those without cars, my point, in a city like East St. Louis, they're left on the fringes, because now you have to figure out how early you're going to leave to get to work, and what buses you have to plan. Thank goodness for the Metrolink now, if it runs in the direction you're going in, right? So those without cars are left on the fringes. And in general, any one of those groups of people who are, all of those who I've described, if they're poor, not just working class, but poor, they feel the brunt of those burdens especially. So those are some of the people that come to mind that are struggling, that are left out on the fringes, right? And I can go into any more of that later, but I don't want to hog the mic.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, Kay, that'd be wonderful.
I want to go back, please, to the red brick halls. Loving history, I visited Philadelphia and was so impressed by what you see in Philadelphia halls there, and it reminds me about. People hardly read anymore. Not you students probably, but they really don't. Reading is not not the same as it was when my generation was. I mean, we read constantly. I mean, long reading, like books.
Whole books,
full articles. With sources and. But so we need, she brings up in this poem the red brick halls. She puts this in a building, and that building is used to imagine what went on in the past, what went on when these sachems came and talked about laws that unify everyone, so that there's these buildings. Because we're fallible and we don't read and we can't remember and it's hard to imagine, if we have these buildings and a place, like I live just a few miles from the Trail of Tears, and if you stand at the Mississippi where those people were a full winter and hundreds died freezing at the shores of the Mississippi, you can imagine it there. You can imagine what it looked like. So as a way to sustain a community and a culture, we need to reflect from places, just because we're not so great at remembering. So these places are important to keep in a community in East St. Louis and everywhere, just to have a touchstone. So that's one way I think that communities and sustainability of history is maintained. Yep.
And Jim, just on this topic, so I appreciate that, Kay, of talking about places too, but just thinking about people and places struggling, lacking resources, opportunity. What does that look like in your own community?
Well, let me speak to oppression first, because that was the center of the poem. And we know peoples have been oppressed. We don't often appreciate that after Illinois was made a state in 1818, the legislature immediately enacted black codes for the state that were more strict than some of those in the southern states. So blacks in Illinois, a free state, were not free. So there's obviously been oppression. My Irish forebears were persecuted upon their arrival in the mid-1800s in the U.S. And yet I was encouraged by Cindy's poem, where she spoke of courage and standing strong and by the lady who spoke about the young people and her appreciation for their hard work, and for Claudia, who talked about the accomplishments of her children. In other words, we cannot use the oppression of the 1800s as a crutch. We have to be strong and courageous today in achieving.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think about, not to replace other things said, but to add to it, is when we look, some of the words in there were, here some people were in these halls of brotherly love, right? Philadelphia, from ancient Greek, right? Brotherly love. And so, and yet planning to do some things that weren't that nice to other groups of people. And so I think that equality is in the eye of the beholder, in a way, right? So you're saying we're going to be in these halls fixing certain laws so that there's equality, but we, or some of us in this hall, they probably had some differences of opinion, but some of us see some people as more equal than others, right? And so I think that's a theme throughout the founding of the United States, and that could be another 20 or 30 discussions, right? But it's important, because I think that, just like, you know, I appreciate the call for all of us to do the best we can now, because this is what we have now, right? I'm a big believer. It's funny, if I'm out talking here, I'm going to preach for understanding for some of our people, especially youngsters of color that make some bad decisions, because we don't have a whole lot of options. So we got like this many options, and it's not good that we make bad decisions, but sometimes, you know, we smoke a reefer when we're 15, and now we're at Cook County, and I know a lot of white kids that snorted a lot of coke when they were 15, but daddy knew the judge, so they didn't go to jail. But and I'm not saying it's this easy, right? I'm just saying, like, I personally know friends who went to Cook County, they smoked a reefer, it was a stupid thing, you know, I'm pissed at them to this day, but then there's bail. It's not that much. It's a few $100s. Family doesn't have it. So now it's like, well, we're going to let Jimmy take 10 days in Cook County, you know, in Chicago. He'll get out. Problem is, at some point, Jimmy's got to go shower. What happens when you go shower in Cook County? You better declare, are you a gangster disciple? Are you a Latin king? And you better hurry up and decide. And they're not playing. It's not funny. It's a little bit funny here. It's not funny there, because someone's going to shank you. And I'm not talking about leave a little wound. Like, you might not live. So you got a minute or two to go, okay, I'm with you, man, hurry up. And okay, now we're going to protect you. You go shower here, right? Or I'm with you. You protect me. I'm going to go shower here. Now I come out and I go back to Ashland and 51st. I can never cross west from Ashland, east side to the west side. I can never do that again in my life, or I'll be killed, right? That's a serious life choice for a 15-year-old. I know you guys have that here in East St. Louis too. And so I think, how do we look at how we're coming from these differences, right? So then when I moralize to them, right, and say, get a job, you know, they say, which job you talking about? One that pays minimum wage, one, and I'm not, and see, when I'm with my own folks, I tend to be a little harder, because I'm like, I don't care, get a job, you know, because I want to preach let's do the best we can, and we're going to fight the oppression too, right? But we're not going to feel sorry for ourselves. I hate people moaning and groaning. Hate it, right? If it's not important to do something about it, be quiet, honestly. I just assume you don't say much to me. Get up, because there's so many of us. We're the vast majority, right? We just don't get our stuff together. But I'll end this section with this. But for the youngsters, what I try to do is I'm not going to say do whatever you want like it's an excuse. No. But I'm going to say, okay, you have a point there. But if we build a movement, then the nihilistic behavior of a lot of violent youngsters in Chicago, because they don't see much. You and I might think they have something to look at. They don't think they do, right? So it doesn't really matter what I might tell them. They don't see anything. When I talk to the young Latinos, some of them, and again, I'm going to still battle them on this, right? Because I want them to have individual responsibility. What they tell me is, okay, you want me to go take this job down the street? Hey man, at least it's a job. My dad worked at that factory 30 years. Called nasty names for Mexican people every day, made minimum wage, and when he left, no retirement pension, right? Because in the United States, there's nothing if you don't have a union contract. So He was called all these names, had to go, yes, sir, oh, yes, sir, every day. And I'm not going to do that, man. I'm not going to go do that. So what I tell them is those are our jobs. We should demand them. So instead of sort of going, well, gosh, you're kind of right, so I guess we won't do anything, what I say is, I challenge you. You want to be a man? Fight for justice. That's a man. Don't be out there shooting at other folks with a Glock. What's that, man? Come and let's go take those jobs. We're going to work at those jobs. We're going to fight to make them better jobs. We're going to fight so that we can stay in our communities and rent here or own a home. So one of the greatest things for me about movement building, however we envision that, and I think it happens in rural areas too. I think it's very similar. There's just little differences. Is if we don't create a path for youngsters, thinking of youngsters in individual response, to fight for their future, they're going to fight among themselves, right? We have to create that path. So when they come to us and go, oh yeah, Leon, you talk a good game. Well, what can I do? I don't go, I don't know. I'll get back to you. I got to say, hey man, what are you doing next Sunday? We're going to go to this plant, right? Because your uncle worked there, your aunt worked there, right? You're being driven out of your home. So it's up to us to formulate that path. Then we can, I think, challenge those youngsters to do something. Otherwise, we're challenging them, but they don't see which direction to go, right? So I think that's the fun part about this work, though. It can, we can help lead others into it.
And Leonie, thank you. And Jim, too, I just wanted to comment, because one of the things I think we're trying to do is illuminate some of the differences. And I think part of the reason I wanted to bring this word oppression in is because I do think I hear a lot a difference of some people feeling like that's potentially something that happened in the past that's not current day happening, that the black codes didn't just exist in the past, but in fact have just repurposed themselves in different ways now, in the same way that Native people are still struggling to survive, even with this history, right? So I think, and what we sort of know about intergenerational trauma, the idea that trauma is carried in the DNA and passed down. So I just want to name that as a thing that I think we all very much disagree about in many ways, about is that a thing of the past and people are making excuses, or is that an explanation that helps us diagnose something that's going on that we can treat better if we understand how do we get there. So I just want to name that as a difference. Claudia, please.
Referring to the last two lines, how can there be democracy without the means to live? Again, undocumented people do not have a voice. It seems like they have no rights. And last week, a parent came to me with a form that was delivered at his house. It was a child support document that was under the name that he was using to work. And he asked me, what can I do? Should I call this number and tell them how much do I have to pay, even when it's not my child, because I want to keep these papers? And I said, gosh, you are in a hard situation, because he has been working 10 years in that place until all of a sudden there was a child. And the mother was requesting to pay him child support and court cost and this child to be included in his insurance. And he has his own, he had 2 kids in the school system. And I told him, you better find another job. And I feel, okay, these undocumented people in my town, they struggle to survive. They get paid less because the places that hire them know they are undocumented and they don't have insurance. They don't get raises. They don't get vacation. I had a friend who worked 5 years and he didn't get any single day for vacation in 5 years because the employer knew he was undocumented. So this is the things that I see in my community. These people are left out.
Thank you, Claudia. Before we turn, and we're going to sort of what gives people hope and what things are important, I just want to ask, are there other just immediate tensions? Like I tried to name this word oppression about in the past, how we operate in the past. But are there other sort of challenges or tensions in your communities that you could say, like, yeah, this is a thing people are really disagreeing about, that just come to mind?
One of the things in East St. Louis that is constantly debated, and it's for good reason that it is debated, we have several gas stations and now a grocery store that, who owns them? Not residents of East St. Louis, and also not black folks. So I guess I would then say, because I don't want to assume Middle Easterners, right? So, and it's not a problem necessarily that they own them. The issue arises from prejudice that happens as a result of them owning these establishments. So black folks in the city, because that's primarily who are here, there are others, but primarily black folks in East St. Louis, have there's tension with shopping at the local gas station, which sometimes is the closest place that you can get to get a grocery, right? Or some food maybe, right? Because again, the much like you, Jim, in your community, the one prominent grocery store it was closed, and another one reopened that is not reputable at all. Okay, meaning molded food, you got to double check dates, those sorts of things. Okay, so that's a tension that immediately comes to mind, is there's this racial and ethnic dynamic that goes on. And a part of that I would even layer in gender. For instance, I would go to, when I was in a certain area in East St. Louis, I would go to my local gas station to get a coffee, a cappuccino, on my way to school. Now, this was years ago when I was working on my master's at SIUE. And I would stop by this particular gas station, and I noticed every time I went into the gas station, I was always short at about 10-cent change. It's 10 cents, right? It's thank goodness, thank God my life is one where 10 cent will not break me. Okay, some people it will. But I noticed this and I thought to myself, I wonder how many times this has happened. So I decided I'm gonna go back at least 2 more times, right? Because being a thinker and a student of math, you need 2 points to confirm a line. But if you have 3 points, you know it's a line, right? You know. And so I do this each time, and I'm shorted 10 cent, 12 cent. 5 cents each time. The last time I go in, I explain to the same location to the man working behind the register, you know, this is the 3rd time you guys have shorted me my change. And his response was meant to woo me, I'm guessing. Woo.
I'm taking it didn't work.
Flirt his way out of it, and it didn't. No, of course it didn't work. But I said, I just want you to know that I notice. I want you to also know that I count, and that other people in this community also can count. So you probably should stop doing that. And that is not to say that every one of these locations and businesses do that. But what I'm saying is it creates an atmosphere of distrust between locals and those who they also, not only do they own the businesses, they don't live in the community. So there's no investment. It isn't, oh, that's Cindy from down the street and around the corner. They don't know me from Eve, right? They don't know. So that's one of the immediate tensions that comes to mind. That's also one of the ways I think we struggle as residents of this city, is feeling like you're powerless. We don't own the businesses. We don't own the gas stations. We don't, right? So that feeling of powerlessness, and there's more that goes into that. But that's an immediate answer to your question.
I appreciate that, Claudia.
I think that there's a reason that's really based on a historical racism in the country, which is blacks are shunned for entrepreneurial efforts. One of the ways that can be solved is microlending. You know, microlending in a community like East St. Louis could open up all kinds of doors for your own businesses and small businesses, and you have to start somewhere.
You absolutely do.
It's all about racism.
and at the end of the conversation, that's where we go back to. Like, that's for this city. If we're just gonna talk straight about it in this city, that's one of the things it goes back to. And so, although we can say enslavement, I'm losing my descriptor right now, but
Institutional racism.
That's a part of the problem now still too. But actual chattel enslavement, the institution of slavery, that's what I was trying to say, is long done. We cannot ignore the fact that those psychological strands of oppression still stand today, and they manifest today, all the way down to this little, to me, this is what they didn't say this is what in Cindy's head they was, oh, this little black girl doesn't count. She won't know the difference, right? It manifests all the way down to that, right? Not only that she's black, but that she's also a girl, right? A woman. She won't catch the difference. No, I did a whole experiment on y'all, and you didn't even know it. 3 times. I won't come again. And in addition to that, told people around me, hey, don't go to that one. They take your money.
And so Cindy, you're referring to something about the pervasiveness of anti-blackness as a result. And Kay, I'd love to get into it, but I also, maybe you and Jim both, you can speak to this, but I know that one of the things we talked about in preparing for this discussion was the part of preserving community and culture is to decide the things you don't want to carry forward. What are the things, and Jim in particular had mentioned the racism in small towns, and I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes, when we talk about conserving culture, I'm thinking that we may not want to conserve all of the culture that we have brought forward, and my little community, white, has lots of racism within it, in large part because of ignorance. Many in the community simply don't know others of different color or philosophies, and so it's kind of an us versus them mentality, which is part of the human animal drive. And so, yes, we don't want to carry all of our culture forward. We want to address it. But very quickly, on the point you asked about earlier, tensions, my community is all white, and there's a tension developing, and I don't want to be judgmental here, in which almost half the births in my county last year were to single mothers. Now, there are fathers involved, so it's not a single mother challenge by itself. But because the single mothers who are in my community generally not well educated, they struggle with minimum wage jobs. They generally receive state support. And as a result, there's a kind of separation among that world and what I call the connected world that my newspaper reports upon, the people who belong to the clubs and are connected and doing well in school and that sort of thing. And as a result, we're developing a community of the connected and the lost. And the lost are often these single mothers who lack the support structure that would be ideal, and as a result, they are lost and they don't know how to connect. And it's a tension in our community. I just wanted to identify it because you asked.
Yeah. And can I get Kay in, and then Vince? Can I get Vince to just respond to that, and then Kay, I'll come right back to you. Because Vince, I'm guessing you have something to share about that.
I guess, Nolan, one of the things people fail to understand, because we have this myth of this single mother. I worked for a community action agency, and so we were serving like 5,000 people. We tried to identify who comes for help over here, and yes, it was a single mother, about 21 years of age, hadn't finished high school, had one child, and white. The majority of folks who are on public assistance happen to be single mothers, and the majority happen to be white, right? And so we need to define that and make sure that people understand that. And when we talk about, there's another point I want to make, is one of the reasons why that has become so important in the community is because we've become immune to what I call and people have written about it, a permanent war culture. We spend the majority of our taxes on the Pentagon. An F-35, which is antique already, where for the next few years we're going to spend $1 trillion on that. And what is it going to be used for? It's going to end up in the desert in Arizona with the rest of those other aircraft that we build and get rid of, because the Saudis only have so much money. $110 billion, $1 million. I don't think they're going to buy every plane and every bomb that we make. So our resources, and when we talk about the community, then the resources in the minority community is being sucked up by the military. There's not enough programs and funds available to sustain the services that are needed. The micro-lending program, Small Business Administration. Who's going to provide the funds for micro-lending? Well, all these resources are drying up because we're very much concerned with a 17-year-old war that's continuing. Thousands of our young men and women are dying, but all these things are distracting. We've been distracted by what's happening in my community. Yesterday, someone dropped me off from the old tennis club, and she talked about the woman who lived across the street from her, a mother, single mother, 7 kids, and just went on for a while. And I tried to explain to her that that was not the total picture, She needed to understand the whole situation. But we're getting distracted from that. The whole definition of what is it to be an American is being changed. What is a real American is being changed. It is being redefined at the national level. I read from one of my dissertations in social work, is one of the conditions of being an American is to be aware of the fact that a whole lot of people around you are different. Different in their origins, different in their religions, different in their lifestyles. And that's what makes an American, more so than what is being redefined today. We need to accept each other as Americans and not as different strangers. I was telling Kelly earlier, there's one of the problems we've developed now is being suspicious of the other, of the stranger, suspicious in our own communities, the people who come next door. And you've read all those stories about calling the police because some guy was taking his suitcase into his own apartment, but he gets arrested by the police. So we get, and we're told to watch out for strangers. And if you think it's suspicious, call, right? Mm-hmm. So what kind of a culture are we developing? Why should we be suspicious?
Then you pass it over to Kay. Thank you, Vince. Great.
All these problems are real, the need for money for micro-lending and the need for social services. And yes, the Pentagon's getting too much money to make war. But the big tension we're all feeling is the huge disparity in wealth in this country. In 1929, before the Great Depression, the people talk about it in history books. The problem was that the wealthy controlled 40% of the 1% controlled 40%. Well, the middle class was getting nothing. It wasn't until after the Depression and FDR that the middle class was grown, and that went away. What is that statistic right now? 40%. Less than 1% controls 40% of all the wealth. I just hate to hear it, that they have all of us little people squabbling over resources and where to put it. There's plenty of resources in this country. There are billionaires. Jared Kushner paid no taxes. These people are just ripping us apart. And we should not be fighting among ourselves for any of this stuff. That's the tension every single person feels on the farms, in small towns, and in urban areas. And this has to stop, and it's not going to be easy to turn this around. But we have to stand together on that one for sure, I think.
Thank you so much, Kay. And I'm just mindful of time. We're getting here toward the end. So what I'm going to do in the last bit, we have about 13 minutes left. I'm just going to ask us to start with Claudia if we can, and just talk about what gives you hope and what strengths you see in the people, cultural strengths or others that are helping people to thrive and survive in your community.
Well, sorry if someone might get it in a different way, but with the Trump administration in my community, I see very hard for my people to get legal documents so they can get a decent job. And at least what they can do is to learn a language and work in the shadows, work under someone else's name, pay someone else's child support. But I think get educated, maybe the ones who can vote as legislators to write like more equal laws so we all have the same rights and we all can have a voice. That's the what I see, and the future are our children. We need to educate our children.
Thank you.
I'm going to squish in a little pre-thing and then I'll get to that. But one thing I wanted to say about the resources is I agree. I think this is for a future date. Maybe we can continue to dialogue and stay in contact and so on. But I think at some point, people will have to discuss our economic system. And capitalism cannot exist without unemployment, right? So I'm trying to even stay away from judgment, good or bad, but if you believe in a free market, when you're on the receiving end, it doesn't feel that good. If you are born into a wealthier family, it feels really good. And whatever we think of it, which we don't have time to get into today, the way our educational system works is we learn about social and cultural matters that you may agree or not, but you learn something about them, right? But we're never taught to think, not just see something a certain person's way, but about our economic activity. So our economic activity in the United States is beyond morality, right? So like the young guy said in Pittsfield, right? Saying, well, I disagree with Leone because Leone is saying natural market forces are evil. They're not evil, they're nothing, they're neutral, right? But somehow we are very upset about human beings who are bullies, who are violent, and who are aggressive. But when you do that through our economic system, it's a pass, right? So, and you may say, so what? I still love it, great. But that is true, that's not an opinion. You can just say, well, that's good, that's bad. If you have 20 kids, right, in my daughter's preschool, and 2 of them take all the cookies, not one person in this room will say that's good. Well, there are people in this country that have all those cookies. All of them. And if you agree, then agree. Don't complain. But I think it's wrong. And I don't understand why we don't judge people morally on their economic activity. I just don't understand it. That's me. But we can minimally talk about it. So you don't have to agree with me, but in our system, you don't know about labor. You come out of high school, Social Security, we're the greatest country on earth. You know how we got Social Security? You know how we got the National Labor Relations Act? You know how you got the right to form a union? And blah, 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 blah. People fought and died for it, man. Women couldn't vote. Congress didn't wake up one day and do, oh, we're going to have a GI plan, we're going to help people come back from Europe. That's the biggest government program in our history. Biggest government program in our history. Helped a whole lot of white folks. Formed the middle class. Thank God. Thank God, right? Tennessee Valley Authority, right? But we're not taught enough to then have critical debate on our system that allows people to come into East St. Louis, buy everything up, raise your property taxes, kick you out, and then own it of whatever color they may be, right? So I just think that I'll turn that into a hopeful thing, Kelly, that like with our organization and others, I think perhaps, and it's kind of sad, but perhaps the desperation of the unequal wealth can drive us, maybe, even if it's out of desperation, to actually talk with folks that we just don't think we have anything in common with. Because you basically find out you have everything in common with them. And then now it's just how do we fight together to make sure that people have the economic necessities, right? Just the basics. After that, we can discuss all the rest.
And Leone, just maybe you already answered this, but I just think, what do you see happening? I mean, maybe it's not hope, but what do you see happening that you think needs to happen and keep happening?
Well, I mean, I'll say for our organization, small things. A lot of our Latino members, when I told them that I was going to Pittsfield to talk with probably mainly white folks about, rural urban issues and all that, they were like, why are you doing that? That's a waste of time, right? Like, you're the executive director, you should be here working. That's stupid. And they said, why are you doing it? And for some of them I said, because you think it's stupid, right? Because now we're actually talking about it. And now when I get back, I'll tell you how stupid it was, right? And then sure enough, they have a square. They don't want that cool square to go away, just like we don't want the National Museum of Mexican Art across the street to go away. And they're both about to go away, and same folks roughly own them, right? Whether, friends or whatever, but the same kinds of companies. So I think that the willingness of in our organization, African Americans and Latinos, to talk about the tension, I think that's one of the biggest problems in Chicago and in the United States. In a few years, people of color will be half the population, right? And that explains a lot of what's going on in this country right now. A lot of the reactionaryism is people going, oh shit, I'm not going to be in the majority anymore. And you know what I tell them? They ain't going to hurt you at all. No one's going to come hurt you. I'm not. I don't even care about you. No one's going to do anything. You get to keep a job. Everything's going to be great. But right? But it's going to be fine. But we can't allow that hysteria, like you were saying over here, about to erase what's really happening, which is the wealth, right? The wealth flowing up. That affects. It's funny how it affects all of us the same way. Some a little less. So I see the hopefulness in, and I'm just trying to be real. Some of our members thinks it's really an okay use of our time for blacks and Latinos in Chicago to talk with each other. Some don't, but the fact that at least some think it's a good thing is positive. We have to take those first steps.
Can I add something to what you said? Just something quickly. I'm a school teacher, and I have seen my school district that more than 50% of our children are non-white kids.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, and I want all four of you in, so maybe just take a minute. Something that gives you hope, something good or right you see happening in your community.
Well, I read a book called Born on Third Base. It's written by Chuck Collins. He was a 1%er, and he makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. What he suggests is that we should really get to know some of these folks who are wealthy. And what he has done, the forward of the book is written by the chairperson of the Patriotic Millionaires, a group of wealthy Americans trying to make the point that the policies that create gross inequality in our society are not good for regular Americans and are also not good for the rich. So it isn't that all 1%ers are bad. It is some 1%ers, as you know, you've heard about Bill Gates, right? And his foundation, and the Clinton administration foundation, and I could name a few other millionaire foundations. When you turn on your PBS newscast, you see the list of people who are making contributions. Most of them are millionaires. And so it isn't like they're not contributing something to the country. And let me just quickly read this last passage here. He says, so he was born into this very rich family. He gave all his money away. He called his father and he said, I'm giving my money to the foundations, and which he did. And his job, he sees, is going and talking to millionaires and trying to convince them that they should put more money into these foundations. Well, he said, what an exciting time to be alive. I'm confident, our job is to serve as hospice workers for the old world, the old story, as it sputters to its predictable demise. And we must serve as midwives to the new world, the new story, as it is born and comes into being. There will be loss, farewells, and the end of comfortable and predictable futures. There will be passings, memorials, tributes, and unwindings of familiar institutions and practices. And there will be a birth of community, connection, and a flourishing of face-to-face culture. We will have to depend on one another in ways we haven't before. We will be called to act in ways we have not been called before. And so we have tremendous inner capacities to respond to challenges. We have latent generosity and powers of mutuality that are awaiting to emerge. So, for those who can hold and control the wealth in the commons will either withdraw to illusionary private paradises or rejoin humanity, warts and all. So, he says there is still hope, and he hopes that he can change a lot of these wealthy millionaires to share their wealth.
So I have a handful of hopes and strengths. I'll leave you guys with just two, though. Two that I would like you to think about. The first would be a hope is education. And now let me explain what I mean. I don't just mean going to school and getting a degree. That's great, do that too. But having the hard conversations surrounding systematic racism, classism, ageism, and all those isms that especially affect people in small cities and towns like East St. Louis, right? Like rural Pittsfield, those kinds of conversations, but particularly because I am the resident homegirl on the panel in East St. Louis, right? Amongst students. And I don't mean just those who are on their way to college. I mean the young kids too, so that they can understand that a city like East St. Louis is not an urban nightmare anomaly. It's not. It's actually pretty systematic across the country, right? Because of issues like urban crisis and all the correlating issues that go along with urban crisis, right? Suburbanization, disinvestment or divestment, deindustrialization, all of these things, right? So I believe, so one of my hopes for the future is that we begin to shift the morale of East St. Louisans through education by telling them it's not you, baby. It's not your city that's just deviant alone. There are larger systems that got you to this spot. So education. And then secondly, and I guess it goes along with education as well, it's countering these hegemonic narratives, these pervasive negative narratives of East St. Louis, right? Every narrative that catches fire about East St. Louis is one that's damaging and demeaning in some way, shape, or form, when clearly we're sitting here and no gunshots have flown past us, and you understand what I'm saying? Everyone's fed and safe. Yes. So countering those dominant, hegemonic, damaging narratives that are constantly put out there to say that there are other stories. I'm not saying that those negative ones aren't someone's experience, but what I'm saying is that there are other experiences that are not told, right? And as a result, we get to the spot where most of the stories we accept and believe, even East St. Louisans, are that we are less than. That's not the truth. There's more to the story. So those are my hopes going forward, that there will be more counter narratives, and that there would be education. Man, I wish I was in a spot where I could go in every school in the city and teach, but I can't, right? So hope for the future is that educators moving forward, perhaps I can do a workshop or something along those lines for educators to be able to infuse those conversations into the classroom.
Thank you, Cindy. Okay.
A hopeful sign for me over the last 3 years is the work of investigative journalists at all levels. I'm addicted to the New York Times. Contrary to what our president wants to say, journalists are doing very hard, very dangerous now, and very good work. Even down to the level of our regional paper, I've noticed the difference. And it took a lot of us writing into that paper to say, hey, what about this? You didn't look into this. You didn't cover this side of this. And they changed. And that can happen. We're going to need the truth. And a free press is all we got to give it to us. So stand behind your journalists, and here is one. Jim is a journalist.
I'm, in my past, was a politician and government executive, and whenever I was kicked out of government and politics, I took refuge at the University of Illinois and used my union card, my PhD, to teach. And my hopefulness is based on the energy and the positive, exciting spirit of the students I've had. And our big challenge is to get more youngsters from struggling communities onto that level of positive energy and positive hope for the future.
Thank you so much. So I just want to say in closing, and I'm sure, Matt, I don't know if you want to have any comments. So just in closing, I want to say Jim, Kay, Cindy, Vince, Leona, and Claudia, thank you all for your time and your dedication and sharing your perspectives. It's also just been an honor to get to know you. Sometimes I send them some stuff that they have to look at that they're just like, what is this? So they hang in there with me, and I really appreciate that. And I also just want to say thank you to Illinois Humanities, to Matt, who's been a wonderful partner in this, and Paul as well, who's in the back. And thank all of you for spending 2 hours here, to the children and the young people here. Hats off to you. Thank you all so much for being here. Much appreciate it.
Let me just make one quick comment as we're on our way out, because I meant to say this when we got started. We talked a little bit about what a rich cultural history East St. Louis has. East St. Louis and this area just recently lost a cultural icon whom I wanted to kind of acknowledge. In fact, I was going to say we ought to sort of have this discussion in his memory. Gabriel, terrific DJ who worked at radio stations in this part of the country for years and was really a human encyclopedia of African-American music and radio. So anyway, just want to pay a quick tribute to him as one of the zillions upon zillions of great representatives of the culture of East St. Louis.
Thank you, Matt.